So when we're talking about human impacts, we're really talking about the population of humans on our planet and what is the impact that we have based on a growing population. We've surpassed 7 billion people on this planet. And so as our population increases, how is our population going to be affecting the overall Earth system as a whole? Ecology is the study of interactions of organisms with their environment. And so when we're getting into this idea of human influence or human impacts on Earth systems, we're really talking about ecology. Population growth is a measure of the birth rate versus the death rate. When our birth rate exceeds the death rate, our populations grow. When the death rate exceeds the birth rate, populations decrease. When the two are equal, we end up with equal population. No increase, no decrease. So we use age distribution graphs to help us understand that. And we can see in an increase in population, the pre-reproductive age usually has a larger number of individuals within the population than the reproductive ages and the post-reproductive ages. So we end up with kind of a true pyramid, and that tells us that as we move into the next decade, the next 2 decades, the next 3 decades, this population is going to slowly continue to increase because this pre-reproductive age is going to bump up to here, and they're going to start having children in their reproductive ages. And so the population is probably going to be a little bit larger with the assumption that they have more children than what the 2 individuals having children could have. So we would get an increase in population if for every 2 people you had individuals that were having 3 children. We can have stable populations. Many of the world's developed countries have a population that looks a little bit more like this, where it's stable. It's more of a column versus a pyramid. Many of our undeveloped countries exhibit populations that look like this increasing population graph. And then a decreasing population graph looks like this, where we're actually, the bottom of that pyramid that was here is actually going the opposite. So it's kind of like diamond shape. We're ending up with less children being born to the previous generation. And so we end up with a constriction of the bottom of that graph. So again, talking about developed countries versus less developed countries, this is typically what we see in developed countries, partially because having children is expensive. And when you live in a developed world and money kind of controls a lot of what you're doing, people choose to not have as many children. So oftentimes for every 2 individuals that decide to start a family, they end up having 2 children. And so when they leave this world, they leave behind 2 for the number that was them. Whereas less developed countries, oftentimes it becomes a benefit to have lots of children. Well, part of that benefit is disease, famine, those types of things play into populations in those areas, having children that do not make it to reproductive ages. They pass before they get to reproductive ages. And so those in those countries, oftentimes you have lots of children with the understanding that not all of your children will probably make it to adulthood. It also becomes a benefit in these countries to have excess child help, especially if you're running a farm. Excess hands help for the amount of work that is involved, and so having lots of children becomes a benefit. For a long time in our country, we had families that had many, many children. If you talk to your grandparents about the number of children that were in their family, oftentimes it's anywhere from 5 to 12 in many families. And so many of those families lived on farms. The extra hands were useful on a farm. And so many families had lots of children. That doesn't necessarily occur in our country today. So we are part of Earth's ecosystem. Our activities can either unintentionally or deliberately change the balance that happens in our ecosystems. Some of the things that we have talked about in the past regarding human influence include like climate change. As we add more and more CO2 to the atmosphere, CO2 is being absorbed by the ocean. We learned that carbon dioxide turns into this stuff called carbonic acid inside of water. And carbonic acid can actually cause coral bleaching that we see here in this picture. And so an inadvertent effect of us just simply burning fossil fuels might be that we're changing the acidity of the ocean just enough that's negatively impacting large areas of coral. We also may be affecting the overall atmospheric temperatures due to carbon dioxide release into the atmosphere. If carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas and we're noticing that it's storing more and more heat, then it would be logical to say our temperatures on this planet are slowly going to increase. And in fact, we do notice slight temperature increases in the last 60 years. So we've talked about ice cores being an indicator of prior atmospheric concentrations. They give us kind of a snapshot of the past and what the atmosphere may have looked like back then. And we've noticed that there is actually a decrease in the amount of CO2 the further back we go in ice cores. Another human impact is deforestation. So we remove wood products. We use them for building homes, we might just be clearing forests just for the process of planting, for having farmland. We might be using them or clearing forests for roadways. So deforestation actually causes habitat fragmentation. And that forces plants and animals into confined areas. So think about the last time that you were on the highway. You notice inside the highway in the middle between the two lanes, oftentimes there's a section of habitat that some organisms can live in. But as a whole, you don't see a lot of deer running around in the middle of the highway or between the two roadways. I was on 127 north of here quite a ways this weekend. And I always drive through there, and I look at that center area of the woodlot between the two northbound and southbound highways, and I always think to myself, well, that's kind of a cool little nature area. But ultimately, there's not a whole lot of nature that really is there except for the trees and the plants that you see, because we've really fragmented it. You don't have very many deer or raccoons or other animals making their way across that highway, and if they try, oftentimes there's negative consequences. So because of that, we've come up with some different ways in which we attempt to help with this fragmentation idea. This right here is a bridge just specifically built for animal migrations or animal movement. So things like deer or your raccoon or possum or some of those other animals that are confined to the land, they can move to and from different sections of land without having the interference of the traffic. Now, guiding organisms to specific locations is a little more difficult. They tend to have that free will thing where they're like, this looks like a good place to cross the highway. They make the choice to cross the highway in a place that is not necessarily great, and the 18-wheeler works like a giant meat grinder. Deforestation. Continuing on with this topic, we use deforestation as a practice for getting the wood resources that we need. Obviously, we're not going to use less wood. We are going to produce our houses using wood in this country and in this portion of the country. We have an abundance of wood lots here in Michigan, and so we use that wood for heating our homes, for making paper, for building furniture, and for building our houses. We also clear land in order for agriculture. So much of the United States was originally forested, and over time we have harvested a lot of that wood product. So this image is from 1650, and the total wood lot coverage that we would have had in our country. And by 1850, we can see a reduce in the amount. Notice that northern Michigan is predominantly where we find in 1850 the woodlands. By the 1920s, this is what our woodland forests looked like in this country. And we had done a very good job of harvesting off many of the timbers that originally existed in our country. Now, if we were to go forward in time, we would actually notice a larger amount of growth in forested land in our state than what we did in the 1920s, because we've adopted practices that are more sustainable. There are some environmental costs of deforestation. Anytime we remove vegetation, we have an increased amount of erosion. Anytime it rains, soil's going to move to different locations if there's not roots to trees keeping it in place. That then removes nutrients from the soil. It ends up moving those nutrients to bodies of water oftentimes. And then there's sometimes negative effects to those nutrients being added to water because it's an excess fertilizer that's going to cause eutrophication in water. Forested areas do tend to modify climate. If you go in the woods during a nice hot summer day, oftentimes you notice the temperature is a little bit lower in the shade versus out in an area where there is no forest. They do provide habitat and recreation as well. In the tropical rainforests, one of the major concerns with that area is that as we're removing trees and we're removing this forest, there's not a lot of soil underneath these trees. And so in our country, yes, we did. We absolutely went through a deforestation timeline in our history in order to make way for agriculture. And many of the tropical rainforest regions are going through very similar things right now, where individuals are trying to make an income. They're removing the forested land. The problem is that as they were removing the forested land in those areas, there is very little fertile soil below these trees. And so you end up with a situation where the land is cleared and agriculture starts, and within a very short period of time, the land is no longer fertile, and products of agriculture are not very good at producing a crop. So we end up with a situation where the soil is not as productive in tropical areas as what it would have been if you just left the tropical rainforest there. So this image right here is showing deforestation, where, and this is 1986, August 4th, 1986. By 2001, this is more what it looked like, and this was around settlements. So settlements here, we slowly deforest. But by 2001, we ended up with very large areas where deforestation had taken place because those settlements are slowly spreading out. Right here is along roadways. So we've got the road that's running through the rainforest. It's kind of following different paths with the terrain. And then over time, we can see from 2000 to 2001, this section that is actually being completely deforested that didn't exist, kind of following this roadway. So the effects of deforestation, there's a reduce in biodiversity, a reduce in the number of species that can live in that ecosystem. There is an impact on climate as we end up with these small-scale climates that end up warmer because you just don't have as much shade. And also remember that trees transpire, so they're giving water vapor off into the atmosphere, thereby allowing for cooling to take place. CO2 also helps to be trapped in woodlots, and so less trees equals less CO2 trapping. And our human population pressure is actually increasing in the tropical regions, and so as we continue to have populations increase there, we're going to need more and more space available for people. Modification of ecosystems to exploit resources. Agriculture is one of the big ones. Mining is another one. Deforestation for wood products is another. There are a number of different methods of deforestation. First one is clear cutting. So in that case, we're just going in, we're removing all of the wood products from a specific location. Sometimes when we did that, we would come and reforest, but oftentimes we just reforested with conifers because they grew very quickly. Conifers are your pine trees. So think about driving north of, in the northern portions of our state, and you see these perfect lined rows of pine trees. That is a product of reforestation. We would go back in, we would plant trees after we had harvested them out, but instead of making them sporadic, we would just line them up straight because we could run a plow in a straight direction and then just put a bunch of trees in it. That is a reforestation method. We can use patchwork clear cutting, where we typically go in and we kind of choose a little section where we clear cut, but then we move over a little ways further and choose a little section where we clear cut. And so we end up with these patching systems where we end up with small spots that are deforested. It is good for specific species. Deer, for example, really like patchwork or field edge type ecosystems. Rabbits it does pretty good for as well, but it's not a benefit for all species. We do also do a lot of selective harvesting now, and a lot of times you'll see this in national forest or you'll see it in private land, where you get a hold of somebody and you say, you know what, I've got some timber that's of value and I would be interested in you coming and giving me a price for that timber. And so what they do is they come in and they kind of choose the specific trees that are of a certain value. They mark them. They offer you a certain quote for coming in and harvesting all those wood products. And then you say yay or nay. And then if you say yes, they come in and they just take that specific species out. This is probably the least invasive method of deforestation, where you're removing one type of tree, which then allows for undergrowth to come back up, and the reforestation is maybe not needed as much. It does leave more of a natural forest. Desertification is another human impact. It's typically happening in arid and semi-arid lands. So what it is it ends up creating land that is not getting a lot of water. It's changing the habitat to the point where it's not becoming a productive land for agriculture or for habitats. And so it's slowly expanding these arid and semi-arid regions, causing regions around them to become more of a desert. One of the things that we did we noticed that we created in the 60s and 70s was this ozone hole. And then by the 80s, we really had started to fix the problem. The ozone depletion was caused by CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons. They were used in refrigerants, and then when they were released into the atmosphere, what they did was they actually broke down ozone. So O3 is the protective layer of our atmosphere that blocks out UV light. And the more and more of these aerosols, these chlorofluorocarbons that were released in the atmosphere, the more deterioration of the ozone took place. And so we ended up with large areas where ultraviolet radiation was actually getting through the atmosphere. And so here we can see one of the thinnest layers down around Antarctica. There's some other thin areas that occur in other portions. Specifically, there was a larger one over the Pacific Ocean. As we stopped using chlorofluorocarbons, that hole did slightly reduce. It's not as much of a concern today as what it was in the 80s. Fishing activities is another human impact. We do have a very high demand for fish and shellfish. People consume it. Commercial fishing can be very harmful to the environment if not practiced in a sustainable way. We've gotten really good at using nets and other things to catch fish. And so finding ways in which to reduce the amount of commercial fishing as to not negatively affect the natural populations is going to be important. But part of that is the idea of aquaculture, where we're trying to develop facilities where we can grow fish or shellfish in an enclosed environment, and then we can just harvest that product and send it to market, maybe without negatively impacting the natural ecosystems. So fish landings by tons throughout our history since 1850. Notice we reached a peak in the mid-1960s where we had pulled 800,000 tons of fish from the ocean. We have seen a gradual decline ever since, and part of that gradual decline is the fact that populations have been impaired to the point where we just don't catch things as much. We do have quite a bit of reduction, even till today, and part of that is due to the fact that we've gotten better at commercially growing fish in things like net pens, and then we can send those to market where we haven't necessarily had to go just out in the ocean and catch everything that we put in the market. Invasive species has been another human impact, also known as exotic species. So that's either intentionally or accidentally putting a species in a given environment. The problem is that what we've discovered is that when we accidentally do that or intentionally do that, there's no predators to that species. So a cane toad is an example of that, where these toads end up getting put in the natural environment. There's no predator, their population explodes, they grow like crazy and they keep reproducing, and the population gets to the point where it either has lots of effects of disease or it overeats in the environment, creating negative effects to other populations. So that is definitely a concern with regard to a human impact on natural environments. Exotic pet trade is another negative effect that humans have. So we capture and sell wild animals for sending them to market. And when I say sending them to market, not necessarily for consumption, but people like exotic animals as pets. And so we're taking them from the natural world. Oftentimes they're the rare organisms that we're taking from the natural world because those are the ones that pull a greater value. And so then we send them to things like pet stores and sell them for pets, and it negatively impacts natural populations. We're going to watch a real quick video here. Why are there so many tigers in Texas? This is a Minute Earth video related to the exotic pet trade of tigers in Texas. In the image, we can see the exotic bird trade. So catching exotic birds and then selling them at market is definitely going to be something that influences populations in the wild. Think of the movie like Rio, where the poachers are coming in, they're catching a bunch of organisms, they're taking them to pet stores to be sold. Our movement increases problems of invasive species. So as we talked earlier, moving different species into a new environment where they didn't previously exist. It also increases the idea of emerging infectious disease. As we as humans continue to spread into natural environments, we increase the probability of being in contact with organisms that we can end up transferring diseases to us from. One of the perfect examples currently is the idea of COVID, and right now the thought is that it came from a market in Asia due to us going out and catching and trapping animals for food, where we didn't handle things very well as far as how we brought in that species. And when you end up with a lot of different species living in one area that are maybe not dead at the time or have been harvested, you get a higher likelihood of transference of disease. So biodiversity is important. When we have high biodiversity, we have many different organisms in a specific ecosystem, and organisms depend on one another. And interfering with one organism can have many ripple effects within the habitat. Natural systems are more diverse than man-made systems. So we think about crops. Many times in our fields, we are using just monoculture. We're growing one species of plant. Whereas in natural systems, there's a lot of different species that are living in that environment, and they're living off of one another. And so oftentimes when we have human influence, we end up with a biodiversity loss in that area. And that can lead to extinction of some species. So why should we worry about extinction? Well, one of them is an ethical concern. Animals have a fundamental right to exist. One of them is an ecological concern. We have species that play specific roles in ecosystems working as a whole. They may be useful to us. For example, medical. We have less than 1% of the tropical rainforest species have been tested for pharmaceutical use, but 40% of the drugs that we use are plant derivatives. They've come from some type of plant. There's a couple of different legal classifications you're probably familiar with. Endangered is a very low population, and it has the potential of extinction. Threatened is they still exist in large numbers, but their population is in a declining state. And so there's a concern that a threatened organism may become an endangered organism. We do have a number of biodiversity preservation areas. Think of like Yellowstone National Park or Glacier National Park. These are areas where we have minimized human influence on the populations of organisms. Oftentimes hunting is not allowed in those areas. And so we end up with populations that are living with minimal effects of humans outside of just simply people coming in and maybe photographing and doing things that would not involve taking of animals. Oftentimes less developed countries do not have these areas, and when they do, poaching becomes a very high problem. Because in less developed countries, when you're able to make quite a bit of money off of things like ivory from the tusks of elephants, poaching becomes more and more of a tempting thing when you're sitting there struggling between getting food for your kids or an elephant that's living down the road that could give you a lot of monetary resource over a long period of time. And so poaching does become more and more prevalent in less developed countries because of the fact that there is a need for economic resources. So this map right here is called the Human Footprint Map. It shows the entire amount of human influence in any one given area. And so we can see here in the central portion of the United States, we have a lot of human influence. As we make our way further and further north, minimal human influence. Still in parts of the tropical rainforest areas, minimal human influence. Right here in the central part of Africa, around the Sahara, there is minimal human influence. Well, part of that is because people can't live there. So the human footprint is a quantitative analysis of human influence across our globe. That ranges from 0 being minimum to 100 being maximum for each biome. A score of 1 indicates the least amount of human influence in that biome. It is set up based on 4 factors, and they include population density, land transformation, so how did we go about moving or reorganizing the land itself, changing the land. Human access, can we even get to that location? When we think about like the Rocky Mountains, there's some areas that it's very difficult for humans to even get into. And then power infrastructure is another one. Land transformation poses the single greatest threat to biodiversity because as we reduce habitats, we have a higher and higher probability of negatively impacting populations of organisms. Increased human access through roads, rivers, and coastlines can lead to more pollution and invasive species as well. And both human access and land transformation have been fueled by increased access to fossil fuels and electrical power. All of our natural cycles that we have talked about in this class can be altered by humans. So thinking about the carbon cycle. Well, if we're using more and more fossil fuels, we're releasing more and more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. That's an effect on the carbon cycle. So use of fossil fuels is affecting the carbon cycle as a whole. The nitrogen and phosphorus cycles are very much affected by agriculture. We use nitrogen and we use phosphorus on fields for fertilizers because they're limiting nutrients. So we have to be careful about how we use the natural resources or the natural systems, and we have to use them in a manner that is allowing for conservation. We need to have some sustainability. Obviously, fossil fuels are limited, so using them in a sustainable manner is important. So things like making sure that you run the dishwasher when the dishwasher is completely full of dishes, or running your washing machine with only full loads of laundry, running your dryer when you only have a full load of laundry. Don't run a dryer to dry just one shirt or one pair of pants, which is something I'm sure all of us are probably guilty of at different times. Scientists are studying how our traditional use of energy affects Earth's systems, and currently one of the concerns is the estimated coal reserves. The thought was that they'll last about another 200 years, but within the next 20 years we will have used up about half of the Earth's oil supply. And so in a very brief period of time, in the last about 150 years, we've used up half of the overall oil supply found on our planet. Well, what's going to happen in the future is prices are going to go higher because there's less of a resource available if people are going to continue to need to use that product. And so we need to find ways of using alternative energy sources as these traditional energy sources slowly dry up. Another effect is that mining can affect our surfaces. We do strip mining oftentimes, so that can affect ecosystems. Fossil fuel and nuclear power may add pollution to the air, water, and or soil. Mining is something that we continue to use in this country. It's very important. One of the things that we have to do with mines, no matter the type of mine it is, we go through a process called reclamation, where after we've taken the resource out of the environment that we want to take out, we have to return that land back to what it looked like prior to mining taking place. So we're required to change the environment back to what it looked like. Fossil fuel procurement affects the environment and contributes to air pollution as well. Strip mining removes plants and topsoil, so we need to make sure we're putting that back, and some runoff can then affect waterways. Burning coal releases large amounts of sulfur dioxide that can end up in the atmosphere and then turn into acid precipitation. And we've talked about air pollution in the past. Conservation. So conservation is the wise use and preservation of natural resources. It can help to reduce environmental damage, and it can allow us to have the resources that we need at rates that are useful, that allows that resource to last longer. We do a lot of mineral conservation, like recycling. Think about your pop cans that you take back. That would be using that mineral resource in a different way, or just simply reusing it. We do also just reuse products in different ways. Oftentimes this is focusing on non-renewable energy resources or non-renewable mineral resources. Consuming fossil fuels we just talked about. You've probably heard the reduce, reuse, and recycle model, or motto. That allows us to use the resources in a way that would not cause their usage to be faster than what we need those resources in. We need to be very responsible about how we go about using the natural resources that we have on any one day.